The crystal glass felt cold and alien in Liam's hand. It was a vessel for champagne he had no intention of drinking, a prop he was required to hold to complete the picture of polite irrelevance. He stood near the edge of the sprawling living room, a ghost at the feast celebrating his own prolonged humiliation. The room, with its panoramic views of the city skyline, was intimately familiar. For 2 years it had been his home. For the 5 years since, it had been the gilded cage where his memory was kept, polished and periodically spat upon by its new inhabitants. This was Chloe's apartment, or rather, it was the apartment he still paid for, a fact that had become the central, tragicomic joke in the lives of her new family. Tonight was Chloe's engagement party to Julian Croft, a man whose smile was as expensive and insincere as his watch. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and self-congratulation. "There he is," Eleanor Croft, Julian's mother, murmured to a cluster of her friends, her voice a silken weapon. She gestured with her champagne flute, a subtle movement that directed 5 pairs of judgmental eyes toward Liam. The benefactor, so devoted even after all this time. The women tittered, a sound like ice cracking. They saw a man of average height in a well-worn but clean suit, his shoulders set in a posture of quiet endurance. They saw his calm, unassuming face and mistook stillness for weakness. They saw the poor X, a pathetic satellite still caught in the gravitational pull of a woman who had long since moved on to a brighter star. Julian's father, Richard Croft, a man built like a monument to his own success, strode over to Liam. He didn't offer a handshake. He clapped Liam on the shoulder with a force that was meant to be both familiar and belittling. "Liam, good of you to come. Thought you might want to see what a real celebration looks like." Liam met his gaze. "It's a beautiful party, Richard." "Of course it is," Richard boomed, his voice filling the space around them. "We do things properly. Speaking of which," he lowered his voice to a conspiratorial growl, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Julian tells me this month's check came through on time. Good man. It's important to have consistency even well, in your situation." The insult was perfectly crafted, delivered as a compliment. It implied that Liam's only remaining virtue was his reliability in subsidizing the life of his replacement. Liam's face remained a placid mask. Inside his pocket, his fingers found a small, cool piece of metal. It was an old-fashioned brass key, its teeth worn smooth with time. He'd carried it for 5 years. It was his secret, his anchor in this sea of condescension. They thought he was clinging to the past. They had no idea he was holding the key to their future. Julian drifted over, draping a proprietary arm around Chloe, who stood beside him looking radiant and deeply uncomfortable. "Liam," Julian said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity, "I'm so glad you could make it. It means the world to Chloe. Shows there are no hard feelings." "There are no hard feelings," Liam agreed, his eyes briefly meeting Chloe's. He saw a flicker of the woman he once loved, a shadow of guilt in her eyes before it was snuffed out by the dazzling reality of her new life. She had made her choice, and she wore it like a diamond necklace. "We're actually going to have some big news about this place later," Julian continued, gesturing around the apartment. "A new chapter, a final one, you could say. It's time to tidy things up." The threat was clear. His financial support, the last tenuous thread connecting him to Chloe, was about to be ceremoniously snipped. They thought this was the end of a sad little story. They didn't know it was the prologue to a much larger one. Within 2 hours, everyone in this room, so confident in their wealth and position, would understand the profound difference between the appearance of power and the quiet, patient reality of it. The truth, like a slow-acting poison, had been working its way through the foundations of their world for 5 years. Tonight, the symptoms would finally begin to show. And as the laughter of the oblivious crowd washed over him, Liam held the cold key in his pocket and waited. He had learned that patience was the most powerful asset of all, a currency that the rich and reckless always seem to spend too quickly. Before we dive into how this all began, I just wanted to say thank you for being here. Stories like this are about the moments that define us, and I'm so glad to share this one with you. If you enjoy seeing patience and integrity win the day, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And I'm always curious, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. All right, let's go back 5 years and see how a simple promise became a weapon in disguise. The rain on the window pane 5 years ago had looked like tears. Inside the apartment, this very apartment, the silence was a physical weight. Every object seemed to hold a memory. The worn armchair where he read, the small crack in the ceiling they'd nicknamed the river, the collection of mismatched mugs in the kitchen. It was all a museum of a life that had just ended. "I can't afford this place on my own, Liam," Chloe had said, her voice thin and frayed. She was curled on the sofa, a fortress of cushions around her. "Not with my salary. I'll have to move back in with my parents." The thought was unbearable to her, and Liam knew it. Her parents' home was a place of constant, low-grade criticism. It would suffocate the fragile confidence she had. He looked at her, the woman he had spent the last 4 years building a life with, and felt a pang of profound, aching responsibility. The love was gone, eroded by 1,000 small disagreements and one big one. He was a dreamer, an architect with a steady but modest job, and she craved a world of certainty and shine that he couldn't provide. She hadn't said it in so many words, but he saw it in the way she looked at magazines, the way she talked about her friends' lavish vacations. "You won't have to," he said, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the plan. "I'll cover the rent. For a while, until you're on your feet." She looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and relief. "You'd do that?" "Of course," he said, and he meant it. It was a final act of love, a way to ensure the person he had cared for so deeply landed softly. "Let's say a year. That gives you time to figure things out, maybe get that promotion you've been working for." "A year," she repeated, the words a lifeline. "Okay, a year." She started to cry then, not with sadness for their end, but with gratitude for his generosity. It was a subtle distinction, but it was one Liam felt keenly. He was no longer her partner, he was her first safety net. He moved out the following weekend, packing his life into cardboard boxes. The last thing he did was place his key on the kitchen counter. "You should change the locks," he'd advised. She'd nodded, but they both knew she probably wouldn't. For the first 6 months, it worked as planned. He transferred the money on the first of every month. They spoke occasionally, cordial and distant. He was working on a side project, a small design competition for a community library. It consumed his nights and weekends, a welcome distraction from the hollow space in his life. He won. The prize money wasn't life-changing, but a senior partner at his firm, a man named Mr. Abernathy, took notice. He saw something in Liam's design, a blend of classicism and efficiency that appealed to his old-school sensibilities. He started giving Liam more significant projects. Then Chloe met Julian. She told him about it on the phone, her voice bubbling with an excitement he hadn't heard since their early days. Julian was in finance. He was charming, ambitious, and from a family with a name that opened doors. Liam was happy for her, genuinely. His promise had been to help her land on her feet, and it seemed she had landed in a field of clover. The first meeting was a disaster. Chloe had invited him for a drink to formally meet Julian. It was at a sleek, minimalist bar where the cocktails cost more than a decent meal. Julian was everything Liam was not: loud, polished, and radiating an unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance. "So, you're the famous Liam," Julian said, shaking his hand with a grip that was all about establishing dominance. "Chloe's told me so much about you. You're an architect, right? Design buildings?" "Something like that," Liam said. "Fascinating," Julian said without a hint of fascination. I'm in acquisitions. We buy buildings. Guess we're in the same business in a way. Only my way is more profitable. He laughed. Chloe forced a smile. The conversation went downhill from there. Julian learned, through Chloe's nervous chatter, that Liam was still paying her rent. His eyes lit up with a kind of predatory glee. It was the perfect piece of information, a tool he could use to define Liam completely. "You're still paying for the apartment?" Julian asked, feigning surprise. "Wow, that's incredibly generous." He drew the word out, infusing it with pity. "Chloe, darling, you didn't tell me you had a patron." Chloe flushed. "It's not like that, Julian. It was an agreement we made when we broke up." Of course," Julian said, patting her hand. "Still, a man of principle. I respect that." He turned to Liam, his smile widening. "But don't you worry. I'll be taking care of her from now on. You'll be free of your obligation very soon." Liam left the bar that night with the bitter taste of condescension in his mouth. It wasn't just Julian. It was Chloe's silence, her failure to defend the dignity of their shared past. She was already learning the rules of her new world. You don't correct the man who is buying you dinner. A month later, he met Julian's parents. It was an accident. He was dropping off a book Chloe had left at his old place, and they were there, having just arrived for a surprise visit. Richard and Eleanor Croft were Julian in concentrated form. Richard assessed him with a quick, dismissive glance, the kind a man gives to a waiter or a valet. Eleanor's smile was a masterpiece of social warfare, warm on the surface, arctic beneath. Within 5 minutes, Julian had, with practiced casualness, relayed the story of Liam's patronage. Richard had chuckled. "Well, I'll be. A modern-day arrangement. Son, you found a woman with a good benefits package." Eleanor had placed a delicate hand on Chloe's arm. "My dear, it's sweet, but a little sad, don't you think? You must let us help you become fully independent of these old ties." They spoke about him as if he weren't in the room. He was no longer a person. He was a topic, an amusing anecdote. The poor X. The name wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air, dense and suffocating. As he walked away from the building that day, he felt a cold resolve hardening within him. The 1-year agreement was nearing its end. He could stop the payments, cut the cord, and walk away. It was the logical thing to do. But as he stood on the pavement, looking up at the window of his old life, another thought took root. They saw his payments as a sign of weakness, of pathetic attachment. They had taken an act of kindness and twisted it into a joke. What if, he thought, he let them keep telling that joke? What if he leaned into their perception of him? He had just been made a junior partner at his firm, thanks to Mr. Abernathy's mentorship. His financial situation was quietly, but rapidly, improving. He could afford it. He could afford to be underestimated. For now. He made a decision. The year would come and go, the payments would continue, and he would wait. The 1-year mark passed with a quiet phone call. "Liam, about the rent," Chloe began, her voice hesitant. "I know our year is up." "Don't worry about it," he said, his tone even. "Things are fine on my end. Just focus on your work. Is everything okay with Julian?" He could hear the relief in her sigh. "Yes, everything's wonderful. He's amazing. His family, they're incredible." She didn't mention that his family had begun referring to him, in her presence, as the landlord of lost causes. She didn't tell him that Julian joked to their friends about having his girlfriend's ex on a monthly retainer. She took the money and the path of least resistance. Her silence was the ink on a new, unspoken contract. So 5 years began. 5 years of quiet transfers and loud humiliations. The arrangement became a fixed part of their dynamic, a bizarre tradition. The mockery escalated from private snickering to a form of public theater. At Chloe's 30th birthday party, held at the Crofts' palatial estate, Julian insisted on making a toast. "To Chloe," he'd said, raising his glass, "a woman who inspires such loyalty, even from her past. In fact, I'd like to give a special shout out to our friend Liam, who helps keep a roof over this beautiful girl's head. A true gentleman of the old school. Let's hear it for Liam. A smattering of confused, pitying applause followed. Liam, who had been cornered into attending by a pleading Chloe, simply raised his glass in a silent, neutral acknowledgement. He felt the stares, 100 pinpricks of condescension. He saw Richard Croft give him a dismissive wink. During this ordeal, his hand was in his pocket, a habit he'd developed, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn brass key. It was a tangible reminder that their stage was built on a foundation he owned. Another time at Christmas, he dropped off a small gift for Chloe along with the check. Eleanor Croft answered the door. "Oh, Liam, how thoughtful," she said, taking the small wrapped box as if it were contaminated. "You really don't have to do all this, you know. We're taking very good care of her." She smiled, a razor blade wrapped in velvet. In fact, Richard just bought her the most divine little convertible. She's so thrilled. It's a shame you can't see it. It's parked in the residence garage, of course. The implication was clear. While you provide the basic necessity of shelter, we provide the luxuries. We are winning. Through it all, Liam's own life was transforming, silently and profoundly. After Mr. Abernathy retired, he had taken a risk. He and two other junior partners bought out the firm, rebranding it as Northlight Architectural. Liam's quiet competence in innovative designs, once a side note, became the firm's driving force. They landed a contract for a boutique hotel, then another for a series of high-end residential towers. Money was no longer an object. It was a tool, a resource. He started investing, guided by a shrewd financial analyst who was one of Northlight's first clients. His portfolio grew. He lived modestly, not out of necessity, but out of habit, in a deep-seated dislike for ostentation. He drove a 10-year-old sedan. He wore his suits until they frayed. The Crofts saw a man stuck in a rut, a failure to launch. They never thought to look at the stock market, or the business journals, or the skyline of the city that was slowly being reshaped by his designs. His most significant investment was personal. 2 years into the 5-year charade, the building where Chloe lived, a beautiful pre-war structure in a prime location, was put up for sale. Its elderly owner had passed away, and the heirs wanted a quick, private sale. Liam's financial advisor brought it to his attention as a prime real estate opportunity. He didn't hesitate. Through a newly formed trust, managed by a discreet law firm, he bought the entire building. It was a simple, clean transaction. No one knew the identity of the new owner, hidden behind the bland corporate name of the Stonegate Property Trust. The building's management company was kept on to handle day-to-day affairs, instructed that all communications were to go through the trust's legal representative, a calm, methodical lawyer named Mr. Harrison. Liam was now, officially, Chloe's landlord. The rent checks he had been sending to the old owner's management company were now, through a bit of legal and financial redirection, being deposited into an account he controlled. The monthly payment was a fiction, a circular transfer of his own money. It was an accounting entry in a play that only he was watching. He visited his lawyer, Mr. Harrison, to finalize the details. "It's an unusual arrangement, Mr. Vance," Harrison had said, peering over his spectacles. He was a man who had seen every permutation of human folly, but this was a new one. "You own the building. You could simply inform the tenant, Ms. Hayes, that her rent is forgiven." "No," Liam said firmly. "The arrangement must continue exactly as it is. The payments must be expected and received every month. The only difference is where the money ends up." Harrison nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You are paying for more than just rent, it seems." "I'm paying for a promise," Liam replied, "and for patience." He had a new master key cut, a copy of the one the old building superintendent used. It was this key, the brass one, that he began to carry. It felt different from the key to his old apartment. That one had represented a shared life. This one represented a hidden truth. It was a symbol of his quiet, overarching control. Every time Julian or Richard or Eleanor aimed a barb at him, every time they mocked his sad little monthly contribution, he would touch the key in his pocket and feel its solid, reassuring weight. He was not clinging to Chloe. He was owning the ground on which they all stood, laughing at him. And he was letting them dig their own graves, one condescending remark at a time. The final act was set in motion by a single, boastful statement. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Liam was at his office, sketching out a concept for a new urban renewal project. His phone buzzed. It was Chloe. Her calls were rare now, usually reserved for logistical questions or moments of high emotion. "Liam, I have some amazing news," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Oh? Julian and we're engaged." "Congratulations, Chloe," he said, and the sentiment was genuine, if complicated. "I wish you all the best." "Thank you, that means a lot. We're having a party to celebrate, at the apartment, in 2 weeks. I'd really like it if you could come." It was a bold request, even for her. "I don't know if that's a good idea, Chloe." "Please, Liam," she insisted. "It's important to me. It's a new beginning. For everyone. Julian's father is giving us the most incredible gift. He's going to buy the apartment for us. As a wedding present, it will all be settled. Clean slate." Liam froze, the charcoal pencil motionless in his hand. There it was, the end game, the grand gesture designed to be the final, crushing humiliation. Richard Croft, the titan of industry, would swoop in and purchase the very ground of Liam's perceived failure, erasing his last connection and cementing his own family's triumph. "He's buying the apartment?" Liam asked, keeping his voice perfectly level. "Yes, isn't it amazing? We were so worried it might not be for sale, but Richard said that for the right price, everything is for sale. He's going to make the announcement at the party. It's going to be a huge surprise." A surprise indeed. Liam looked out the window of his high-rise office, down at the city sprawling below. He could see two of his own completed buildings from here. "Chloe," he said slowly, "I'll be there." "Oh, thank you, Liam. And, you can bring the check, the last one." Her voice was full of false brightness, the tone of someone trying to make a painful extraction sound like a pleasantry. "I will," he said. "I'll see you in 2 weeks." He hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long moment, the quiet before the storm. The final pieces were clicking into place. They had written the script for their own downfall, and they were about to hand it to him on a silver platter. He picked up his phone again and dialed his lawyer. "Mr. Harrison," he said, "it's Liam Vance. It's time. They're planning to buy the apartment." There was a pause on the other end, and then a low chuckle. "Are they now? And I suppose Richard Croft believes his checkbook is the only key he needs." "That's the assumption," Liam said. "The engagement party is in 2 weeks, at the apartment. He's going to make the announcement then." "How theatrical," Harrison noted dryly. "So what is the protocol, Mr. Vance? How would you like this to proceed?" Liam leaned back in his chair, a slow, cold anger finally allowing itself to surface. For 5 years he had absorbed their scorn. He had been their joke, their cautionary tale. He had done it to honor a promise, but he had also done it because he knew a day like this would come. A day when their arrogance would deliver them, bound and gagged, into his hands. He did not want revenge. Revenge was petty. He wanted something cleaner, more absolute. He wanted justice. He wanted them to be forced to look in the mirror he was about to hold up to them. "I will attend the party," Liam said. "I will let Mr. Croft make his speech. I want him to have his moment. I want them all to feel completely, unassailably triumphant." "A high platform makes for a long fall," Harrison observed. "Exactly. I will handle the initial clarification. But when the denial begins, and it will, I would like you to arrive. Bring the portfolio for the Stonegate Property Trust, the deed of ownership for the building, the articles of incorporation for the trust, the chain of title, and the financial statements showing the disposition of rental income for Unit 7B for the past 60 months. The full arsenal, Harrison said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. It will be my distinct pleasure. Shall we say 9 p.m.? 9 o'clock is perfect, Liam said. Let them have their champagne first. The 2 weeks leading up to the party were a study in contrasts. Liam's days were filled with meetings, site visits, and the quiet, complex work of running a multi-million-dollar architectural firm. He approved a new facade for a museum wing, negotiated a zoning variance with the City Planning Commission, and finalized a deal for a sustainable housing development that would bear his firm's name. His evenings were quiet. He ate simple meals. He read, he sketched, he waited. Meanwhile, the Crofts were in a frenzy of glorious preparation. Chloe would occasionally send him a text, bubbling with details. The caterers were world-class. The flowers were being flown in. Eleanor had hired a string quartet. It was to be the social event of their season, a perfect showcase of Croft power, taste, and generosity. Their confidence was a high, impenetrable wall. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet won, over an enemy they had never bothered to understand. On the evening of the party, Liam dressed with care. He chose the same simple, dark suit he had worn to Chloe's 30th birthday. It was a deliberate choice, a piece of continuity. He wanted to look exactly as they expected him to look, the humble, slightly shabby relic of a bygone era. In his pocket, he placed a crisp, white envelope, and next to it, the worn brass key. The apartment was dazzling, transformed from a home into a showroom. White orchids cascaded from every surface. Waiters moved silently through the crowd with trays of champagne and impossibly small, delicious-looking things on toast. The string quartet was in the corner, playing Vivaldi. It was a perfect picture of effortless wealth. Liam entered without fanfare. He was just one more body in a room of over 100, but he felt the moment his presence was registered. A subtle shift, a few exchanged glances. The guest of dishonor had arrived. Chloe saw him first and hurried over, her smile stretched tight over her anxiety. "Liam, you came." "I said I would," he replied, handing her the white envelope. "The last one." She took it, her fingers brushing his. The envelope felt like a burning coal in her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, then quickly tucked it into her clutch, as if hiding evidence. Julian and his parents descended upon them. "Liam, you made it!" Julian boomed, clapping him on the back again with that same infuriating, condescending force. "Get this man a drink, the good stuff." "No, thank you," Liam said quietly. "I can't stay long." "Nonsense," Richard Croft interjected, steering him further into the room. "You have to stay for the main event. It concerns you, in a way. The closing of a chapter, you might say." Eleanor smiled her icy smile. "Yes, Liam. We feel you deserve to be here to see Chloe truly taken care of. It must be a relief for you." They were laying it on so thick it was almost comical. They weren't just humiliating him, they were savoring it, drawing it out like a fine wine. They positioned him near the center of the room, a captive audience for the coming spectacle. He simply stood there, a rock in the stream of their arrogance, and waited. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked toward 9. At 8:45, Richard Croft tapped a knife against his crystal glass, calling for silence. The chatter subsided. The string quartet faded out. A hush fell over the room. Everyone turned toward Richard, who stood beaming, with Julian and Chloe on either side of him. "Friends, family," Richard began, his voice resonant with practiced authority. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this wonderful occasion. The union of my son Julian and his beautiful fiancée, Chloe." He paused for applause, which came on cue. "A father wants nothing more than to see his son happy, and I have never seen Julian happier." Chloe has brought a wonderful light into his life. And as a symbol of our joy, and to welcome Chloe fully into the Croft family, Eleanor and I would like to give them a gift, a foundation, a place to begin their new life together." He paused again, milking the moment. He gestured around the magnificent room. "This beautiful apartment has been Chloe's home. It has served its purpose, but now it will be their home, truly and completely. I have spoken to my lawyers, and tomorrow morning we will be making a cash offer to purchase this apartment for the happy couple." Another, louder wave of applause, gasps of delight. Chloe looked overwhelmed, tears of joy in her eyes as she hugged Richard. Julian puffed out his chest, the proud recipient of his father's largesse. Then Richard did something Liam had anticipated, but still found breathtaking in its cruelty. He turned and looked directly at Liam. His expression was one of magnanimous pity. "And Liam," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I want to thank you. Truly, you stepped up in a time of need. But your duty is now officially done. You can rest easy knowing that from this day forward, Chloe is a Croft, and we take care of our own." It was the kill shot, a public declaration of his obsolescence. He was dismissed, thanked for his service like a loyal retainer being put out to pasture. The entire room was looking at him, waiting for his reaction. They expected him to nod, to perhaps offer a tight, pained smile, and then slip away into the night, his sad chapter finally, mercifully, closed. Liam did not smile. He did not nod. He simply stood there for a beat, letting the weight of Richard's pronouncement settle. The silence stretched. It became uncomfortable. He took a small, deliberate step forward. "That's a very generous thought, Richard," Liam said, his voice not loud but clear and calm. It cut through the expectant hush with unnerving precision. "A very grand gesture." Richard beamed. "It's the least I could do." "There's just one small problem," Liam continued, his tone still perfectly even. A flicker of annoyance crossed Richard's face. This was not part of the script. "Problem? I don't see a problem. Money is never a problem." Liam looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the curious onlookers. He then settled his gaze back on Richard Croft, a man who had never been told no in his life. "You can't buy this apartment." The statement landed, simple, devastating, final. A collective soft intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Richard Croft's smile faltered, then vanished. He stared at Liam, his expression shifting from triumph to confusion, and then to irritation. "What did you just say?" Richard demanded, his voice losing its warm, booming quality and taking on a hard, metallic edge. "I said," Liam repeated, enunciating each word with calm deliberation, "you can't buy this apartment." He held Richard's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "It's not for sale." A nervous laugh escaped Julian's lips. "Don't be ridiculous, Liam. Dad said it himself. Everything is for sale for the right price. My father is not a man who makes idle offers." "I'm sure he isn't," Liam replied, turning his attention briefly to Julian. "But his offer is irrelevant. The owner of this property is not interested in selling. Not to you, not to your father, not to anyone." Richard Croft took a step forward, his face darkening. He was a man accustomed to swatting away obstacles, not being stonewalled by the hired help. "And how would you know? Who do you think you are? You're the man who pays the rent. You don't have a seat at this table. The owner can be persuaded. I'll find out who they are, and I will have my lawyers make them an offer they cannot refuse." "That's the second problem, Richard," Liam said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. "You can't. The owner is a private trust. They value their privacy. They don't take unsolicited offers." The room was now utterly still. The string quartet might as well have been on another planet. The air crackled with tension. This was no longer a celebration. It was a confrontation. Chloe looked back and forth between Liam and her future father-in-law, her face pale with confusion and a dawning sense of dread. She had expected Liam to shrink away. Instead, he was standing his ground against a titan, and he did not seem to be losing. Richard let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. A trust? That's just a legal shell, a layer of paperwork. I eat trusts for breakfast. I'll buy the whole damn building if I have to. I'll find the man behind the curtain, and I will write him a check that will make his head spin. A faint smile touched Liam's lips for the first time that evening. It was a cold, grim smile. You seem to be under the impression that this is about money, Richard. It isn't. But since you're so determined— He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy. He reached into his pocket, not for the envelope, but for the other object. He pulled out the worn brass key and held it up between his thumb and forefinger, letting it catch the light of the chandelier. "This key," he said softly, "is not for this apartment. It's the master key for the entire building." Richard stared at the key, then back at Liam's face, a look of profound, sputtering disbelief dawning. "What is the meaning of this? Is this some kind of joke?" "I haven't been laughing for 5 years, Richard. Why would I start now?" Liam's voice was like ice. He then began to speak, not just to Richard, but to all of them. He began his list of grievances. "For 5 years, your family has treated my promise to Chloe as a punchline. You've called me her patron, her benefactor, the landlord of lost causes. You've toasted my generosity at parties while mocking my supposed financial state. You've used an act of kindness as a whetstone to sharpen your own sense of superiority." He took a step closer. "You, Eleanor," he said, looking at the woman whose poise was finally beginning to crack, "told me it was sad that Chloe had old ties, even as you enjoyed the stability those ties provided. You, Julian," he turned to the man who now looked small and deflated, "joked to your friends that you had me on a retainer. And you, Richard, just now, you dismissed me like a servant whose duties were no longer required." He turned back to Richard, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You stand here in this room and you talk about buying things. You talk about making offers. You are so blinded by your own wealth that you can't comprehend a world that doesn't operate on your terms. So let me clarify the terms for you." He let the silence stretch for one final, agonizing beat. "You can't buy this building, Richard, because I already own it. I have for the last 3 years. The Stonegate Property Trust, that's my trust. The rent I have been paying every month was a bookkeeping entry, a transfer from one of my accounts to another, to honor a promise I made to Chloe when she had nothing. You haven't been laughing at the poor ex. You've been living in my building, drinking my champagne, and mocking your landlord." The silence that followed was not quiet. It was a roar. It was the sound of 100 jaws dropping, of 100 carefully constructed realities shattering at once. Richard Croft's face, which had been flushed with anger, went slack, the color draining from it until it was the color of ash. Eleanor swayed, putting a hand on a nearby table to steady herself. Julian looked as if he had been physically struck, his eyes wide with a horror that was part humiliation and part dawning, sickening comprehension. Chloe made a small, wounded sound, like an animal in pain. She looked at Liam, truly looked at him for the first time in years. She wasn't seeing the familiar, unassuming man she had taken for granted. She was seeing a stranger, a man of impossible patience and terrifying power, who had stood by silently and watched them all play the fool. Richard found his voice first, a strangled whisper. "You're lying." "Am I?" Liam asked, his voice soft. He glanced toward the doorway of the apartment. As if on cue, the door opened. A distinguished, gray-haired man in a conservative suit stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase. He had the calm, implacable air of someone who was immune to drama. "Mr. Croft," the man said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "My name is David Harrison. I am legal counsel for the Stonegate Property Trust." He walked calmly to the large marble coffee table in the center of the room and opened his briefcase. Mr. Vance asked me to join you to clear up any potential misunderstandings. Harrison began to lay out documents on the table. Each one landed with a soft, definitive thud. This, he said, tapping a thick, bound document, is the deed of ownership for the property located at 1134 Park Avenue, registered to the Stonegate Property Trust. He laid another beside it. These are the articles of incorporation for the trust, naming Mr. Liam Vance as the sole beneficiary and director. He continued, his voice a calm, methodical drumbeat of truth in the wreckage of their arrogance. This is the complete chain of title, showing the transfer of ownership 3 years ago. And this, he said, placing a final, slender folder on the table, is a summary of the rental account for apartment 7B. It shows 60 consecutive monthly payments, originating from an account held by Mr. Vance and deposited into an account controlled by the Stonegate Property Trust. A completely closed loop. No one spoke. No one moved. The evidence was absolute, undeniable, and catastrophic. Richard Croft stared at the papers on the table, his empire of arrogance reduced to a pile of legal documents on a coffee table he didn't own. Liam looked at Chloe. Her face was a mask of utter devastation. The diamonds around her neck seemed to mock her. Glittering symbols of a world she had just discovered was built on sand. The man she had pitied, the man her fiancé's family had used for sport, was the one who held all the cards. The rent he paid wasn't an act of pathetic devotion. It was an act of supreme, hidden power, a quiet promise he had kept while they had loudly broken every rule of decency. The air in the room had become unbreathable. The guests, who had been frozen in shock, began to stir, murmuring to one another. The social event of the season had turned into a public execution, and they were all desperate to flee the scene. They began to make their excuses, slipping away in 2s and 3s, their eyes avoiding the Croft family as if their humiliation were contagious. They offered quick, awkward goodbyes to Liam, their tones now laced with a newfound, fearful respect. Within 15 minutes, the room was nearly empty. Only the string quartet remained, frozen in the corner, unsure whether to pack up or play a dirge. The caterers quietly cleared away the untouched food, and in the center of the room stood the wreckage of the Croft family. Richard was slumped in a chair, his face in his hands. The monumental confidence had crumbled, leaving behind a frail, aging man confronted with a power he couldn't buy and a humiliation he couldn't erase. Eleanor stood stiffly beside him, her face a blank mask of shock, her social armor pierced and shattered. Julian finally moved. He turned not to his father but to Chloe. His face was contorted with a vicious, wounded pride. "You knew," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You must have known." "No," Chloe whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I had no idea. I swear, Julian, I had no idea." "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "You played me. You let me and my family mock him, all while he was your secret sugar daddy, owning the very roof over your head. What a fool you've made of me." The irony was staggering. He was accusing her of the very deception that he and his family had so eagerly projected onto Liam. He wasn't angry that Liam had been wronged. He was furious that he had been made to look foolish. His love for Chloe, it was now clear, was contingent on her being an accessory to his status. Now she was a symbol of his public disgrace. "That's enough, Julian," Liam said, his voice sharp for the first time. Julian whirled on him. You think you're so clever, don't you? Standing by, watching us, pulling the strings. This was a game to you." "It was never a game," Liam said, his voice returning to its calm, steady rhythm. "It was a promise I kept. What you and your family chose to do with that is on you. You built this stage. You wrote this play. I just delivered the final line." Chloe took a hesitant step toward Liam, her hands outstretched as if pleading. "Liam, I'm so sorry. I was weak. I was stupid. I let them. I am so, so sorry." He looked at her, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of the old affection, the memory of the woman he had once loved. But it was buried under 5 years of accumulated disappointment. Her apology was real, he could see that, but it was a battlefield confession, extracted under duress. It had come 5 years too late. "I know," he said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was distant. The warmth was gone. "Mr. Harrison," he said, turning to his lawyer, who was quietly packing his briefcase, "I think we are done here." Mr. Harrison nodded. "Indeed, Mr. Vance." As Liam turned to leave, Richard Croft finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, filled with a desperate, pathetic plea. "What do you want?" he rasped. "My company? An apology? Name your price." Liam paused at the door and looked back at the broken man. "I told you, Richard, this was never about money. I don't want anything from you. Your price is the truth. You get to live with it." He walked out of the apartment, leaving them behind in the silent, flower-filled room that was no longer theirs, under the weight of a humiliation of their own making. He didn't look back. The brass key in his pocket felt, for the first time in a long time, blessedly light. The days that followed were a cascade of consequences. The story of the disastrous engagement party spread through their social and business circles like wildfire. It was too delicious, too perfect a tale of hubris brought low. Richard Croft, the man who could buy anything, publicly humiliated by the quiet, unassuming ex of his son's fiancée, an ex who turned out to be his landlord. It became a legend, whispered at dinner parties and in boardrooms. Richard's reputation for invincibility was shattered. A few of his more nervous business partners, spooked by his public display of poor judgment and arrogance, began to quietly pull back from a major development deal they had been structuring. The foundation of his empire, built as much on perception as on capital, had developed a hairline crack. Julian and Chloe's engagement imploded. Julian could not overcome the wound to his pride. He couldn't look at Chloe without seeing his own humiliation. He saw her not as a partner, but as the living embodiment of his family's greatest social blunder. Their fights were bitter and circular. He accused her of being a knowing accomplice. She accused him of being cruel and shallow. A week after the party, he moved out of the apartment, leaving her alone with the orchids that were now beginning to wilt. The diamond necklace and the convertible were quietly repossessed. Chloe was adrift. Her glittering future had evaporated overnight. Her friends, who were really Julian's friends, stopped calling. She was a pariah, a reminder of the Croft family's spectacular fall from grace. She spent her days in the silent, cavernous apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that was never really hers. 2 weeks after the party, a courier delivered a thick envelope to her. It was not from Liam. It was from the law offices of David Harrison on behalf of the Stonegate Property Trust. Inside was a legal document. It was not an eviction notice, not in the cruel sense. It was a formal, polite, and utterly impersonal notification that her current month-to-month lease would not be renewed. As per the terms of the original agreement, she was being given 30 days' notice to vacate the premises. The cold, legal language was more devastating than any angry outburst could have been. This wasn't personal, it was business. Liam was not punishing her, he was simply closing a file. She was a tenant, and her lease was over. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "I got the notice," she said, her voice small. "I know," he replied. His voice was calm, professional. "Liam, please," she begged, the words tumbling out. "Can't we talk about this? I have nowhere to go. I can't afford a place like this on my own, you know that." "The original agreement was for 1 year, Chloe," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I gave you 5. I kept my promise. I gave you a soft landing. It's time for you to learn to fly on your own." "But I can't pay you back," she cried. "For all those years, the money." "You don't owe me any money," he said. The money was a fiction, a bookkeeping entry. What you owe is something you can't pay back with a check. You owe it to yourself to stand on your own 2 feet, to build a life that isn't subsidized by me, or by the Crofts, or by anyone. There was a long silence on the line. She was finally beginning to understand. The greatest gift he could give her now was not more support, but the absence of it, the forced necessity of independence. "Where will I go?" she whispered. "You're resourceful, Chloe," he said, and for the first time there was a hint of warmth, of the old Liam. "You'll figure it out. It might be hard, but it will be yours." He helped her in one final, anonymous way. He had Mr. Harrison send her a check for a sum equivalent to 3 months' rent, not from him, but from the Tenant Security Deposit Return Fund of the Stonegate Property Trust. It was enough for a deposit and first month's rent on a small, modest apartment in a less fashionable part of the city. It was another soft landing, but this time it was a launch pad, not a gilded cage. She moved out at the end of the month. Liam didn't go to the apartment. He didn't need to. He knew that chapter was finally, truly closed. He had the locks changed the next day. The apartment was renovated and put back on the market, rented to a young family who had no idea of the drama that had unfolded within its walls. 6 months passed. The city continued to change, to grow, to build and rebuild. Liam stood on the rooftop of his firm's latest project, a sleek, environmentally conscious residential tower that had won 3 architectural awards before it was even completed. The wind was cool and clean up here, high above the noise of the streets. He looked out over the skyline he was helping to shape, a landscape of glass and steel and possibility. He had not sought revenge, but a form of justice had unfolded nonetheless. Poetic justice. The Crofts, who were so obsessed with appearances, were now consumed with managing the appearance of their own downfall. Their wealth was a plaster over a wound that refused to heal. They had lost the one thing their money couldn't buy back, their unshakable belief in their own superiority. He thought of Chloe occasionally. He had heard through a mutual acquaintance that she was working as an assistant manager at an art gallery. She lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment that she paid for herself. She was taking pottery classes on the weekends. She was, for the first time in her adult life, building something that was entirely her own. She had been forced into the independence she had always feared, and by all accounts she was slowly, painstakingly, finding her footing. She had been humbled, but not destroyed. Liam felt a sense of peace. He had honored his promise. He had protected his dignity. He had held a mirror up to arrogance and allowed it to see its own reflection. He had learned that true strength wasn't about displaying power, but about having the patience and integrity to use it wisely, or not at all. The world was full of noise, of people like the Crofts, who shouted their worth from the rooftops. But real value, he knew, was built quietly, with solid foundations, integrity, and the kind of patience that could outlast any storm. He no longer carried the brass key in his pocket. He didn't need it anymore. He had turned the key on that chapter of his life, and in doing so, had unlocked his own future. This story is a powerful reminder that a person's true worth is not measured by their bank account, their job title, or the opinions of those who seek to diminish them. It's measured by their integrity, their character, and their quiet adherence to the promises they make, both to others and to themselves. Liam's victory wasn't in revealing his wealth. It was in remaining true to his own principles in the face of years of disrespect. What do you think? Was Liam's patient strategy the right way to handle the situation, or would you have confronted them sooner? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective makes this community what it is. And if you found this story of quiet triumph and poetic justice satisfying, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories that celebrate the power of integrity. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to sharing another story with you soon.